From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's coming up. K-State's Romulo Lollato will talk about alfalfa stands, which may now be exhibiting symptoms of freeze damage from those cold temperatures of mid-April. He'll look at the varying degrees of damage and what you producers can do to help that stand recover. Then, on the latest edition of FSA Coffee Talk, David Schemm has the latest on the USDA's Coronavirus Food Assistance Program and what you farmers and ranchers can do ahead of that anticipated sign-up. And further ahead, K-State's Charlie Lee back with us this week to talk about farm pond development and management in support of largemouth bass. All that and more directly ahead on Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
This is the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today, and with information for you alfalfa growers who may be wondering about the ill appearance of your stands. That could be a result of freeze damage to alfalfa. That's a real possibility in parts of Kansas this year, according to our guest, crop production specialist Romulo Lollato, K-State Research and Extension. So, Romulo, we've heard a lot about the freeze damage to winter wheat in Kansas. Alfalfa, you note, can be quite vulnerable to those late freezing temperatures as well.
Hi, Eric. Yes, thanks for having me on air here today.
Yeah.
And definitely, so if we remember that alfalfa is also coming out of the winter dormancy, and back when we had that freeze event on April 13th through the 17th, it was already taking on some type of spring growth. That freeze event hit the alfalfa crops pretty hard in some parts of the state. So as I'm traveling around, I was already seeing some of those leaves that are bleached out. And sometimes we also see the entire fields really that were actually bleached out. Some of those fields are actually burned back really bad. And now that's been 4 or 5 weeks since that freeze event, they haven't really started to bounce back yet, and that's quite concerning.
And that's rather rare that alfalfa would be so hit as to not recover well. It's a pretty resilient crop, and the damage, therefore, must be much more serious to not only the foliage, but maybe the stems as well, Romulo?
Yeah, so we need to think, whenever we're thinking about this alfalfa damage, right, that the growing point, they're typically at the top of each stem. Right, and it's protected by the little cluster of leaves there. And so it's somewhat protected. And sometimes we can see damage to the cluster of leaves and to the leaves around it, but sometimes the growing point might not be affected, right? And that's what sometimes we see a good recovery from the alfalfa in those conditions. And that seems that was not the case in this case. Now, when that growing point and the top of the stems are damaged, the growth from the alfalfa will rely more on the crown buds, right? The new growth would have to new branching out kind of below in that crown level. If we're still seeing that, the plant might be okay. It might have just some damage, and the yield probably is going to be perhaps reduced, especially now in the first cut, or at least delayed, but the plant might be okay. So how do we assess how do we assess our freeze damage? Mm-hmm. Well, first, I think we have a two-step process here. One step would be looking at the above ground part, at the shoot, and the second one will be looking at the actual roots. Okay, so first, as we're looking for freeze damage in that shoot, right, if we're seeing new shoot growth, if you select an alfalfa plant in the field, which is probably going to be looking quite bleached from this freeze damage, but you're seeing green shoots coming out of it, and the shoots are quite well distributed, like symmetrical all around the plant, that's a good sign. That means that that plant and those roots are probably still good and alive, and you're seeing some recovery there. Now, if those new shoots, they're coming only from one side of the plant instead of all around and symmetrical, right? You just have it coming from one side. very likely that plant, it was damaged by those freezing temperatures. So that's a plant that might yield okay this year, might still have quite a bit of recovery, but depending on how much of the roots were damaged, it might not be there next year. And finally, we have the plants that perhaps were just smaller and that just got hit very, very hard with the freeze and are probably are already killed, right? So we have those three situations. So as we are assessing for that, we really want to make sure that we still have about 40 or so shoots per square foot in the above ground before we're thinking about taking any management decision to that alfalfa crop, right? If we have less than about 40 shoots per square foot, more or less, then the potential of that field is probably very compromised. Now, let's talk about the roots, right? What do we look for in those roots in that second step of assessing freeze damage in alfalfa? So in that case, you need to pull some of those tap roots and kind of split it open lengthwise and look for the color and the kind of how the turgidity of that root. So if it's kind of like an off-white, light yellow type of color, similar to what we see in a potato, for example, then it's a good sign, right? It's a healthy root there. If you're seeing that the entire root system looks that type of potato color and it's nice and firm, as more or less we would have a potato there. Now, if you're opening that shoot and it looks dehydrated, and if it looks dark and sometimes mushy as well, then likely that root is actually gone. So that it suffered enough damage that it's actually gone. Now, sometimes, Eric, we might see that 50% of the root is gone, but we're still seeing shoots out. And in that situation, that plant is probably going to produce this year, or at least this first cut. But then probably by next winter, that plant, if right now more than 50% of that root is affected, then probably that plant's not going to be there anymore by next winter or after next winter. So it's a plant that might have some productivity for this year, but really that partial damage to the root is probably going to take its toll on the plant coming up next year.
Well, Romulo, if the conditions are such that there is above ground damage or root damage to the point where there may well be a hit on the yield and the productivity ability of that stand, is there really much that a producer can do in the immediate term about that? Or are they simply going to need to note this and think on down the road for how productive that stand might be in subsequent years?
Well, there are a few things that we need to be thinking of, right, Eric? First is if you're concerned that the alfalfa field is taking too long, you're seeing some regrowth, but it's taking too long, there's a pretty big chance that stand is still kind of like a pretty short stand, right, below maybe 6 inches or shorter than 6 or 8 inches. Remember that if the crop is shorter than the 6 or 8 inches, it's probably still consuming some of those carbohydrate reserves. And so the roots are not as full of reserve as a taller stand to help regrow. So we're hearing different reports of fields that are recovering better or worse than others. And this could be a factor there. Fields that were taller or larger in that time when we had the freeze damage probably had a more robust root system with more reserves. And so they're probably bouncing back faster. Now, at this point in time, that we've been 4 weeks or so after the freeze, we're not really seeing much regrowth. That's very concerning. Producers could perhaps mow or try to kind of shred some of that top growth to try to stimulate some of that regrowth. Always keeping in mind that you don't want to, especially in this situation, a couple of things to be concerned with is you don't want to go too short. So always leave about 3 inches or so of stubble there that will help encourage regrowth. And this is especially important if there are new shoots coming up, make sure that you don't mow those shoots out. Make sure that those shoots that they are intact, because that's the growth that we're looking for. So that's something that producers can do in the immediate future is like, okay, look for the regrowth. You can see that regrowth is 1 or 2 inches tall only. You might go ahead and shred or mow that stand down to about 3 inches or so, but always being careful not to cut those newly developed stems. Another thing to be watching for, Eric, would be with alfalfa weevil or even with bee aphids, right? Because just like we don't want to cut or mow those new growths, we don't want the insects to affect them either. We were already hearing reports for alfalfa weevil and bee aphids, especially before this freeze. To me, it's a little bit unclear how much the freeze held these back or not, but many cases they can be just there in that stubble, surviving the stubble and then affecting those new regrowths. So especially important to be on the watch out for those. Doesn't mean that you need to spray immediately. You need to spray if you have those insects in the field. But again, be on the watch out for those because we need to protect that regrowth as much as we can.
And lastly, for the long term, one may eventually think about stand renovation at some point if, in fact, that damage is heavy. But that's not for the here and now. That would be further ahead, right?
Yes, at the immediate future, I mean, some producers might consider putting like a type of a summer forage grass type with their alfalfa stand or even some small grain cereal there just to improve the amount of forage taken out of those stands. Of course, the quality is not going to be as high as alfalfa by itself. But if the stand was only affected in portions of the field, that can be an option there. And yes, Eric, as you mentioned, the longevity of that stand, it really depends on our cutting regime. So maybe some of the difference that we're seeing between fields this year can very well be affected by how late the last cutting was last year and how the last cutting was managed last year. So many things to keep in mind there, but more immediate now, you can consider mowing that crop to a good 3 inches height or so. Again, as long as the new stems are not going to be cut, and watching out for insect damage to the new growth.
Well, yet potentially another product of those freezing temperatures through the mid part of April, this time on alfalfa stands in parts of Kansas. Romulo, we always appreciate the updates. Many thanks to you.
Thank you, Eric.
Romulo Lollato is a crop production specialist, K-State Research and Extension. And we'll be back with more. This is Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Welcome back. You are tuned in to Agriculture Today, and now into our regular feature from the Kansas Farm Service Agency State Headquarters, FSA Coffee Talk. And joining us via phone now is the State Executive Director of the Farm Service Agency here in Kansas, David Schemm, whose plate is heaping with things going on concerning USDA programs, David, and not the least of which trying to sort out the final details on that coronavirus aid to producers. But more on that in a moment. Let's get caught up on a few other things, if we might, including sign up for the USDA ARC and PLC payment options for 2020. You have some numbers to share?
I do, Eric, and even though despite our offices, the doors being locked and not being able to person-to-person interact with our producers out there, our offices have obviously still been very busy across the state and busy trying to get things done. Here just this last week, we wrapped up our grassland CRP sign-up for the state and took in all those offers submitted by producers. I've gotten them up to the national office. And then, like you said, we've been in the process of signing up producers for their 2020 ARC PLC. That deadline is not until June 30th, but that doesn't mean we haven't tried to get our producers in there, and they've been great working with us, talking on phone and getting things lined out. We actually have almost 80 or over 86, I should say, % of our producers across or farms across the state already signed up for 2020 ARC PLC. So we're excited about that and very much appreciate our producers willing to work with us and the COVID-19 going on like it is now.
But for that 14% of producers who have not yet made their election on agricultural risk coverage or price loss coverage for their farm program payment purposes. They need to get this taken care of as soon as they possibly can, do they not?
Yeah, absolutely. Get a hold of, call your local office or drop them an email, get an appointment scheduled for when they can take care of you and get you signed up into those programs. We'll have to get documents signed up. Obviously, that's something always a concern. We want to make sure that producers get all their required signatures on the sign up on that, whether it be their landowners or all the operating people within their entity, to be able to make sure they get everything signed up. And that can take a little bit of time, even after that producer has contacted our local office. So definitely encourage them, get a hold of them. Offices are busy right now, but we've got a little bit of time here, and it would be a good time because, as you mentioned already, we've got a new program that we're expecting some more details to be announced real shortly here, and a sign-up date out there. And so we know we're going to be pretty busy dealing with the CFAP program.
Well, do want to mention as well, before we talk about that coronavirus aid, that the Wildfire and Hurricane Indemnity Program, WIP Plus, is open and available for producers who qualify, and that has been an opportunity you'd like to see producers investigate as well.
Yes, absolutely. And with the Congress passed some additional aspects for the WIP Plus program and actually was able to open it up to both a drought factor, so if a producer had drought that affected them in 18 or 19, or excess of moisture. And so when that was opened up and allowed for producers to participate at that level, that really qualified or helped qualify a lot more producers in our state that was impacted by drought, particularly in 2018, but also even some of those that had the excess of moisture as well in 19. So we very much have been reaching out, encouraging producers to get in there, get applied there. I know our offices have been very busy, have been taking those applications and getting them cranked out. So, again, definitely encourage producers, reach out to your local office here and see where they're at and possibly qualify.
And to qualify, one has to be operating in one of the counties that was designated as a disaster area, either by the president or by the Secretary of Agriculture. That's one of the first things that has to be met up with, correct?
Yeah, that is one of the areas, probably for our producers, one of the key things, and I think is going to affect a lot of our producers, is that it's losses that they received as a result of the drought or the excess of moisture. Some of that excess of moisture there, that would be losses that's categorized either by perhaps their crop insurance there, if it was excess of moisture. As far as the drought level, the criteria that we are going by is whether or not the county entered into a D3 level drought during the 18 or 19 season. And so, again, obviously, with that 18 drought having to come up and affected a lot of our central part and southwest and some of our southeast, clear extending up almost to the northeast part of the state, a lot of those counties would qualify then for the WIP Plus based upon the drought monitor level there. There are provisions, though, that if you're not in those areas, but you had losses that could be surrounding to some of the areas covered underneath the WIP Plus program, Eric, there are provisions for producers to go in there and to talk to their local offices, and county committees can review those losses to see possibly if they would qualify. So you're right, if they had a secretarial presidential designation, they automatically qualify as long as they have losses in those areas. But even if they did not get that designation, there are provisions to be able to help those producers, perhaps in counties that did not get that secretarial or presidential designation.
Now, you and your entire team in the FSA are eagerly awaiting, David, the specifics on that Coronavirus Food Assistance Program out of the USDA. The acronym is CFAP or CFAP. Things have been trickling out very slowly here, have they not?
Yes, they have, Eric. And again, obviously, with the dollars authorized by the CARES Act that was passed by Congress, USDA has been in the rulemaking process to get it developed and be able to get those dollars out to our producers out there. Again, we're anticipating a sign-up starting after Memorial Day and getting producers in and getting them start to sign up. I know our producers are very eager to learn a lot more of the details of the information. And I can assure them that we are too. We're pretty vague on the details here, but we are anticipating training to actually start for us and for us to get our employees trained here, actually starting hopefully later this week or first part of next week. Obviously, I know we're getting pretty tight on a deadline here, but that's what our goal is, to get our employees trained and ready to implement that. The one thing that we've been assured of is that we're going to try to make it a very streamlined and easy program for producers to be able to participate in and work with.
So details are spare as we speak. Is there anything that individual producers can be doing to ready for applying for that assistance?
Absolutely. One of the key things, in fact, just recently, Bill Beam, which is a deputy administrator for farm programs, had a webinar just this last week on is for those producers out there who have never engaged with FSA. There's some documentations that we require for when producers do decide to participate in the USDA federal government assistance programs or farm programs there, and we call them the eligibility documents. And so some of them are a 902 or 903 forms, and these are basically eligibility. Some of them have to do specifically with a person being actively, what we would call actively engaged in farming. Some of them have to deal with adjusted gross income to make sure that they're not above a certain threshold that would not allow them to participate in those programs. So some of those documents, those producers, again, that have never engaged with FSA, absolutely call your local service center in your county and talk with them and see what their schedule is and when they can start to help walk you through what documents that you need to get filled out and submitted into them, so that when the sign up for the CFAP program starts, you're able to get in there and just sign up for the program.
And that is of special importance to livestock producers who will qualify for part of this aid and relief and may not have ever, as you say, David, entered into FSA business before, so they can get a jump on this process. And the office protocol at local FSA headquarters, it's not business as normal, but you're certainly open and active.
Absolutely right, Eric. Yeah, that's where we're at. And I would add one small thing onto that is that with the CFAP program, we know it will be livestock producers, but also our specialty crop producers as well out there. So we know that some of them have not necessarily engaged or worked with FSA in the past. So, obviously the fruits and vegetable, fresh produce market producers, they have applications there to be able to work with those producers as well. But yeah, those county offices, and Eric, I know I've shared with you in the past how much our county offices very much enjoy engaging and let's face it, seeing our producers face to face. But unfortunately, we do have offices that are closed. We're continuing to do business, but it is by a telephone call or email and working in through that.
Very well. We appreciate this update on all of these matters, known and breaking items of interest as they develop here, David. So thank you once more for your time, and we will catch up with you again soon.
Sounds good. Thank you, Eric.
And on this FSA Coffee Talk, David Schemm. He's the State Executive Director of the Farm Service Agency here in Kansas on this part of Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you and with today's agricultural news headlines for you now, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, the latest crop progress and condition update for Kansas from the USDA goes like this. For the week ending this past Sunday, our topsoil moisture supplies are at 15% surplus, 51% adequate, and 34% short to very short. Subsoil moisture, 8% surplus, 64% adequate, 28% short to very short. The latest read on the condition of the Kansas winter wheat crop, 40% good to excellent, 37% fair, 23% poor to very poor, with winter wheat jointing at 94%, wheat headed now at 61%. That is behind the 75% average headed for this date over the last 5 years. Corn planting at 74% complete now, emergence at 45%, soybean planting 37% in now. That's well ahead of the 22% average. Emergence of beans at 15%, grain sorghum planted at 9% now. And Kansas range and pasture conditions this week, 53% good to excellent, 34% fair, and 13% poor to very poor. For the national view on crop conditions now, here's the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says heavy rain at the end of last week had an effect on planting progress for corn and soybeans.
Planting before wet weather arrived nearly finished in Iowa, which continues to lead the Midwest and the nation as a whole.
Meanwhile, corn planting numbers for the nation are
80% by May 17th. That remains ahead of the 5-year average of 71% and almost twice the pace of last year's 44% on May 17th, 2019.
The amount of soybeans planted nationwide also is ahead of schedule.
By May 17th, that puts overall progress at 53%, well ahead of the 5-year average of 38%, and more than 3 times the pace of last year's planting for soybeans, just 16% complete on May 17th, 2019.
Rippey says cool weather has hampered winter wheat crop progress.
Overall, 56% of the U.S. winter wheat headed on May 17. That is behind the 5-year average of 62%, but slightly ahead of last year's 51%.
Nationwide, winter wheat condition is 52% good to excellent and 16% very poor to poor, which is similar to last week.
We continue to see a combination of drought and freeze injury affecting the crop across parts of the central and southern Great Plains.
He especially raised concern about winter wheat condition in Colorado and Oregon. This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Following up on our conversation with the Farm Service Agency's David Schemm a few minutes ago, the Office of Management and Budget has now completed its review of the final rule from the USDA for the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. The rule arrived at OMB back on May the 5th. The expectation is that it will be released today, as the USDA has set training for its FSA personnel in 3 installments this Thursday and Friday. Key details, the application process, payments, and updated levels on payment limits. Now, this week's edition of Milk Lines. Here's K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today, I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning our effort to control feed costs as we move through the next several months. As we look at very narrow dairy margins for the next several months, I think it's going to be very important that we look at what we're doing on the feeding side of our dairies. Number one, you're going to have to work with your nutritionist, because I think there needs to be careful evaluation conducted, particularly with our lactation diets, to determine which of the additives that were currently added are really necessary to maintain the level of milk production that we'd like to see in our herd. When I think of those things, I'm thinking about really any additive that we add. It might be a yeast product. It might be a rumen bypass fat. Could be supplemental amino acids. Whatever it is that we're adding above and beyond the normal concentrates that we put into that diet, we need to carefully evaluate that with our nutritionists. You also might want to pay attention to some things like the level of crude protein and the distribution of crude protein between rumen degradable and rumen undegradable in the diet, and whether or not you can make some changes there to maybe feed a protein source that's a little less costly. Second thing I think that's really important to evaluate is the forage percentage in the diet. Again, most of the time, the forages on our dairies are forages that we have raised and we have in inventory. So carefully evaluate what you have in inventory. And then I would maybe consider a little bit of an on-farm test here. Normally our diets for lactating cows are balanced with about 50% forage on a dry matter basis. What if you start moving that percentage up? Been working with some farms where we've gone from 60% forage to 65% forage to 70% forage and stepping the purchase concentrate back as we do that. We usually move about 1 pound of dry matter per step, and we usually wait about 3 to 4 days in between taking steps. Basically, what we're looking for is the balance point, and this will depend on the digestibility and the nutrients that the cows can actually derive from the forages that you're currently feeding. Again, having a stable forage supply helps in trying to make these changes so that we do not damage the ability of cows to produce milk. This may be a way to lower our feeding costs. Second thing I guess I would encourage you to look at is the number of animals that you're actually trying to milk today and the number of animals that you're actually feeding. Worked with a farm recently where we actually decreased the number of cows in the herd by about 6% and actually only experienced in doing that about a 3% drop in the amount of milk shipped. So depending on the target for the amount of milk we want to ship each month, maybe reducing cow numbers is a way to control overall feed cost on our dairies. Then the final thing to consider as we move into heat stress times, and again, we don't want to see that milk production fall any more than what is necessary. So making sure that we have our cooling systems ready to go to cool the cows effectively. I would also suggest you might want to consider when you actually turn those fans on, at what temperature. In the freestall barn, maybe you need to start operating those fans at about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And then consider bringing on limited water, maybe even at as early as 65 degrees Fahrenheit to adequately cool the cows in your herd. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to do what they can to minimize feed costs as well as increase milk production in their dairy herds.
As always, timely information for our dairy producers, Mike. Many thanks. We'll return with more after this final break. You're tuned to Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, our weekly time set aside to visit about wildlife management. Aboard once again is wildlife specialist Charlie Lee, K-State Research and Extension. Charlie, you're going to share some guidelines here on improving the quality of fishing for largemouth bass in farm ponds, and there are several components to this, you say.
Yes. Fishing is a common recreational use of many ponds, and largemouth bass and bluegill are frequently stocked into new and existing ponds for that very purpose. The combination of those two species work well when you develop an initial stocking strategy that's based on science. You do a good job of managing the aquatic plants and managing the fish harvest. But really, the overall satisfaction with ponds starts with pond design and construction and also includes water quality. If you don't have a good water quality, your pond does not hold water, you're not going to be able to develop a quality fishery.
Let's get into the particulars of pond construction then. What's essential here for promoting good water quality and overall habitat?
Well, first, it's the location. Pick a location that has suitable soils and a large enough watershed to keep the pond at the depth that's required in your particular area of the state. The soil needs to have adequate clay in order to seal so it holds water. The watershed area really depends on the pond volume and where you're located in the state. The further west you go, the larger the watershed needs to be in order to keep that pond full. The slope of most of the shorelines on ponds should be at 3-to-1 or 30% so that you minimize erosion. That steep of a slope will limit aquatic plants and will minimize the surface area fluctuation as the pond naturally rises and falls as a result of weather conditions. And I'd like to see a minimum of 8-foot depth. That allows for that water fluctuation and still have adequate depth in a particularly drought year. So that's kind of the pond design and construction parameters. Then we need a basic understanding of water quality. Fish are going to require oxygen. That dissolved oxygen is lowest prior to the sunrise and is highest during the late afternoon because most of that oxygen in the pond is produced by phytoplankton, tiny one-celled plants that are in the water body that tend to turn the water body a slight green coloration. You can measure that water clarity. I like to see at least an 18 inches of water clarity. I think that's ideal. If it's more than about 30 inches, you can have problems with excess aquatic plants. If you've got clay turbidity in the water body, that can be caused by erosion. It can be caused by livestock. It can be caused by certain fish species or wind and soil chemistry, keeping clay particles suspended in the water. I don't think here in Kansas we have to worry too much about pH or alkalinity in water bodies. Water temperature is something we must be aware of, but there's not a lot we can do about that. So those are just some basic parameters on water quality to keep in mind.
So then when it gets to managing aquatic plants, and you mentioned quality of water will influence that, what else can the pond manager and owner do to promote the kind of plant growth that will support largemouth bass?
Well, one is keep in mind that this is not a swimming pool. We're not going to have that unlimited clarity. We've got to have the phytoplankton and some vascular plants in a pond to maximize the productivity. Keep in mind that aquatic plants add a lot of value to a pond with aesthetics. They help improve water quality. They do a good job of limiting erosion. They provide fish habitat. Waterfowl food. There are some negatives associated with aquatic plants, and that includes undesired aesthetics when it gets too large of a percentage of the pond being covered with the plants. But until those aquatic plants cover more than about 25% of a pond, I wouldn't worry about trying to manage the aquatic plants.
So then that takes one to stocking strategy, and we've spoken of this many times with various sport fish, but this is equally important, obviously, with largemouth bass. What needs to be considered there?
Well, keep in mind these stocking strategies can vary slightly depending upon what you have in mind as a goal, but typically they're based on pond surface acres. I like to stock 500 bluegill that are 1 to 3 inches long per acre, usually in August or September. You can substitute some red ear sunfish up to about 200 per acre. Then stock 100 largemouth bass fingerlings per acre during the following spring, as well as 100 channel catfish fingerlings at that same time. Make sure you're purchasing those fish from a reliable source and that they're free from invasive species. So if you start with that type of a stocking strategy, it's difficult to have a complete failure.
But as important as anything is the harvest management when those fish get to that growth point where they can be taken. And just briefly, what needs to be thought of there, Charlie?
Well, you can take a harvestable surplus of largemouth bass. That typically varies up to about 30 pounds per surface acre annually. I think many times farm ponds are large bass over-harvested, particularly in smaller ponds. I'd like to encourage people, if they want to going for only for the big bass, which would be bass that are consistently longer than about 18 inches, that you release all bass under 15 inches for 4 years after that initial stocking. In addition, No bass over 15 inches should be harvested during that time. After that, then you need to start working on those smaller bass, the 8 to 15 inch sized bass. That will allow you to have a few trophy bass in that pond each and every year.
And those are the steps to consider when, in fact, improving the quality of your largemouth bass fishing in your farm pond or other pond impoundment. Charlie, thanks for the word. As always, Charlie Lee is a wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension. And that's our Tuesday edition. Thanks for being along with us, and please rejoin us right here tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.